It's time for us to check back in with the People and Their Quilts and see what John Rice talks about next, or see who he talks to next. If you've missed any of the previous readings, just look in the description below for a playlist. Lillian Steiner, 76 years, a quilter. When I called 88-year-old Lillian Steiner about visiting with her in her Knox County, Tennessee home, she was cordial, friendly, and eager to talk about quilting. However, she informed me she would soon be leaving to see her youngest great-grandchild in Florida, and apologized for having only limited time. When I got to her modern brick home in Hall's Crossroads, I found her luggage piled by the garage door. I found also a spry, agile, and gracious lady who in all aspects of appearance looked like a woman 20 years her junior. It was difficult to talk because of the telephone interruptions. Her granddaughter wanted advice on how to cook pithy turnips. Neighbors called to say goodbye, and finally a special phone call from her boyfriend. It was 96-year-old Harvey Loy, and I could hear and recognize his booming voice from where I sat 10 feet away from the phone. After her conversation with Harvey, I commented on his youthfulness and the fact that he was so active. "Oh yeah," Lillian said. "He drove over here last night and took me out to eat. He drove all the way across Knoxville to the place where we ate, but he's getting to where he doesn't like to drive on the interstate here in town at night too much." Lillian's father was Dr. Winfield Scott Davis of Big Valley in Union County, Tennessee, the area where my ancestors also settled in the late 1700s when that region was an isolated wilderness. I asked her about her life in the beautiful and historic valley and about her long career as a quilter. "Oh, I loved to make quilts. I was just a little girl when I started, when my mother taught me. I was maybe 12 or 13 years old. I made or helped make quilts on until I was married. Then after I was married, I started making quilts for our use and later to give away. I was married almost 50 years and I quilted all that time. Then about 20 years ago, after my husband died, I started quilting for the church. A group of elderly ladies, and some not so elderly, would quilt for people that had quilt tops that had never been quilted. We'd charge them so much, then we'd give all the money to the church, Hall's Central Methodist. We were doing it for the church, and for the people too, for two purposes. They were tickled to death to get their quilts quilted, and they paid us a fair price to get them done." A youthful 88-year-old Lillian Steiner with two of the quilts she made and didn't give away. When I was helping to make the quilts at home, we just made plain quilts because of the warmth and because we needed them to sleep under. We didn't make fancy quilts, although we had some very fancy quilts that had been made by my grandmothers. It seems to go in cycles. They made some fancy quilts back then in my grandparents' time, then they got to making just plain ones, and now, in a lot of places, they're back to the fancy ones again. Not counting the years that I quilted for the church, I've made, with the help of my daughters, about 125, I guess. Never did sell one, gave them away to my grandchildren, and of course we wore a lot of them out, raising 6 children, you know. We quilted the year round. Of course, more quilting was done in the winter time when it was too cold and bad to get out and do anything else. But we quilted in the summer too. Me and my children would go out under the shade tree in the yard and quilt. Take the quilting frames out there and quilt. We just loved to do it. Oh, they didn't like it as well as I did, but they helped me anyway. They were very good hands to do it. My daughter still makes them. She makes lovely quilts. Her name is Ann Schultz. I asked Lillian to tell me a little bit about her early life. Well, as you know, my father was a country doctor. Had his little doctor's office right there next to the house where we lived. He was a school teacher, then he went to school and became a doctor and practiced over 50 years. He traveled all over Union County and part of Claiborne County on horseback and in a buggy. Sometimes I'd go with him when he was going to see somebody we knew. I started teaching when I was 18 years old. I taught at the one-room school at Irwin's Chapel, and my salary was $40 a month. Then I was assistant to my husband after I was married, and I just made $35 a month. Then I taught in a 2-room school with Mr. Harvey Loy. He was the principal and I was his assistant. That was at what they called Union School in Union County, and the pay was just $30 a month. That was in 1914. Let's see, this is 83, that's been 69 years ago. There were 98 students in the school, and he and I made 100 in the group. I had 48 students in my room, and he had 50. Back then, we worked at it. Laughter. Oh yes, I like to make quilts, but I've about quit. Some of the women who were in the quilting group at the church died, some are sick and disabled, and some are just too old, like me. Laughter again. Oh, I can quilt, but I've retired from all the fancy work. I help my daughter quilt on hers. Lillian and Harvey are shown here with their students at Union County and Union County, Tennessee, 69 years ago in 1914. Lillian is at the extreme left and Harvey is at the far right. He was the principal of the school and had 50 students, and she was his assistant with 48 scholars. Lillian is shown here with Harvey Loy, her 96-year-old friend, who frequently drives her across Knoxville to their favorite restaurant. Hannah Lane, from coal mining to quilt making. Hannah Lane lives in the beautiful hills of extreme southwestern Virginia, about halfway between the two historic little towns of Gate City and Fort Blackmore. Maybe that's why the community is called Midway. I had known Hannah for some time, but had no idea whether or not she was a quilter. But since Robin and I were passing through the area, we decided to stop. One question about quilting was all that was necessary to encourage Hannah to tell us all about her long-time interest in making quilts. She took us through the back rooms where several dozen quilts were piled on the beds, in chairs, and in every available space. All of these she had made over a half a century as a quilter. In addition to the completed quilts, there were many other quilt tops stored in trunks and in boxes, waiting their turn to be quilted. Hannah was so interested in showing us her handiwork and in discussing her love for quilts that I had a difficult time getting her back to the kitchen table where I had placed my recorder for the purpose of interviewing her. It was during the interview that Hannah casually mentioned her experiences as a coal miner. From digging coal to piecing quilts, I thought, had to be the most extreme occupational variation yet found in a quilter. Hannah was just as proud of her days as a coal miner as she was as a quilter. Hannah, you said you started helping your mother quilt when you were very young. Tell me about your early childhood and your early quilting. Well, I started helping my mother make quilts before I was old enough to go to school. I could sew pieces together when I don't guess I was over 5 years old. I wasn't big enough to quilt, but I'd help her piece. They was 11 children in my mother's family, 8 boys and 3 girls, and so it took a heap of quilts to do a family that size. I believe you told me that you were born near Pikeville, Kentucky. That's a coal mining area. Was your father a miner? He had a little land, and we farmed, and we dug coal for our own use. The boys, one of them went to the First World War, and the other married and left home, and I was the boy from then on out. I'd go with him, my father, to the coal bank and help him dig coal. He was getting on up in years. He'd bore the holes and put the powder and the dynamite and everything in and get out to where he could see daylight. I would strike the match to light it and set it off. There was one bank where we lived before he bought this place, and there was a track bed in there, and they had a buggy. But most of the mines, they'd never been no track put in them. We had to shovel the coal out to the mouth. You'd have to shovel several times, wouldn't you? Oh, quite a few. Back then, I could throw a shovel full of coal, then plumb from here to the far end of this house. And then you have to get it and shovel it again a few more feet toward the entrance. Yes, sir, several times until we got it out of the mouth of the bank. When we lived at the head of Ferguson's Creek, we worked in a mine for a while that had a little wooden track and what they called a buggy, where we could push the coal out by hand on that buggy and not have to throw it out by shovel. Oh, we thought that was the greatest thing that ever was. Oh, I'd love to go back up there so bad. I just can't hardly stand it. It's been years and years since I was back up there. I've dug many a lump of coal up here at the head of Ferguson's Creek in them mountains. I stayed home till I was 17 and helped my daddy farm and dig coal. He was getting old and disabled and couldn't do much. Now, when you say dug it, did you dig it with a pick? Yes, sir. After it was shot down, we get that out of the way. It was easy dug, you know, being loose. Then when we'd get that dug down, we wouldn't dig any more until he'd bore more holes and shoot out more coal. We had what we called a coal lamp. It was a little round lamp about that big and about that deep. The wick came straight up the middle, and the wick, well, it was just about as big as your little finger, I guess. It burned what we called lamp oil. People call it kerosene now, but we called it just plain old lamp oil. I can remember when my mother didn't have matches. Now, I don't know if there was any matches anywhere else or not, but if they was, we didn't have them. I've seen her take 2 pieces of flint and rub them together and have a piece of cotton, and that was the way we got our fire, made our own fires. Well, Hannah, tell me about your quilting. I loved it, and I love it yet, if I just had room and could. But my hands have been real bad. That's the reason I ain't got these quilts quilted. You said you were 76. You don't look that old. Well, I feel like I'm 176 sometimes. I started helping my mother piece quilts. She would piece these 8 points on paper and tear the paper off then. How many quilts have you made over the years? Mercy goodness, brother. I never did keep account of them. I've sold quite a few, and I give the young'uns. I give 'em all one apiece this Christmas, and about 5 years ago, I give 'em one apiece at Christmas. You say you enjoy quilting when you don't have anything else to do? Why, if I had anything else to do and could leave it, I'd leave it and quilt. I just love to quilt. I love to crochet, and I love to piece quilts. I'd druther sit down and piece one as to quilt it, but I do love to quilt. Hannah Lane, whose childhood was divided between making quilts and mining coal, is shown here with one of her unfinished quilt tops. It is one of many she had pieced but not quilted. Martha Turner of Genesis Road. 84-year-old Martha Turner's life today bears little resemblance to that she knew as a child on the Cumberland Mountain Plateau near Crossville, Tennessee. Though she still lives on Genesis Road in the rural Oak Hill community near her ancestral home, she has electricity, a telephone, television, and other modern conveniences. There is nothing in her present-day front room to remind her of the primitive home of her childhood except the old quilting frame. I must say this residual of the past appears to be a little incongruous in the modern setting, but it was a most practical device then, and it remains so today. When Martha feels like quilting, she merely lowers the frame, raising it when she is finished. I asked Martha how long she had been quilting and what she did with all the quilts she made. I asked about her family and her life on the Cumberland Plateau. Oh, it's been so long back that I don't remember when I started quilting. I've lived here for 56 years, and I was quilting before that. We had 8 children and just 20 acres of land, so we all had to work. My husband died in 1953, and I had all the children to raise. I plowed in the fields with the mules, and I've done every kind of work a man did. I made a big garden till year before last. My rheumatism got so bad in my knees that I had to give up all that kind of work, but I still quilt. I guess I made 15 or 20 a year, and I give them all away. I give them for Christmas presents to my children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. This one here is for my youngest daughter, Joyce. Martha Turner, as we found her on a cold winter day, January 1983, at her suspended frame, quilting as she has done for most of her 84 years. Martha raises her frame by merely wrapping the cloth cord around one section of the frame. Once the frame is raised, the room is returned to normal. Willie's church quilts. Willie Stooksbury Irwin spent several years caring for her invalid father and for her husband, Merle Irwin, whose last years were inactive because of a heart condition. After their respective deaths, she discovered several bags of quilt scraps her mother, Kate Stooksbury, had saved over the years, and some that may have been stored away by her grandmother, Ida George. Many of these scraps had been given to her mother by neighbors who knew of her fondness for making quilts. Much of the material was from chicken and cow feed sacks, and some of the material saved for the quilt backs was from flour and fertilized sacks. Along with these quilt scraps, there was also a number of large bags filled with cotton she had grown, seeded, and stored away for the batting. Although Willie had had only limited exposure to quilting as a girl, she decided to work up some of the pieces left by her mother, and to her surprise, she found quilting to be a fascinating pastime. She has made over 8 quilts from the scraps her mother had, and there are enough left for several more. She has ample cotton left for the padding. The quilts are of good quality, all hand-pieced and quilted. Her price is $40 each. It is not surprising that one of her neighbors bought her entire supply the day after this photograph was made. All the proceeds from the quilts go to the church. So like many quilters, her enjoyment comes not from monetary considerations, but from the self-satisfaction of creating a beautiful object. Alex Stewart, the quilter, at 92. The quilt Alex Stewart's is holding was the last one made by his wife, Margie, who died several years ago, ending their marriage of over 65 years. While this is a colorful quilt, most of those he had were of the old utilitarian patchwork type made from scraps of old coats and woolen trousers. The fabulous Alex Stewart has mastered literally dozens of crafts, professions, and avocations. After visiting with him for almost a quarter century, I thought I knew them all. He is a master blacksmith, musical instrument maker, miller, net maker, stonemason, carpenter, herb doctor, well digger, chair maker, trapper, tanner, moonshiner, crossbow maker, beekeeper, cook, folk art carver, and is doubtless the nation's best-known old-time cooper. I am familiar with these and scores of other skills he possesses. I knew also that he could knit, spin, card, and weave, but I had no idea that this venerable old gentleman from Panther Creek in Hancock County, Tennessee, could also quilt. We were attending his 92nd birthday party in January 1983 when the idea occurred of photographing him holding one of the quilts his late wife had made. The house was full of dozens of well-wishers, and I got his daughter Edith to go into the back room with me to select a quilt. When we handed it to Alex to hold, I jokingly asked him if he could quilt. "You get me a needle and thread and I'll show you whether I can quilt or not," he laughed confidently. Well, Edith did get the needle and thread, and as she did so, she said, "I'll tell you right now that Pap can quilt, better than a lot of women, I guess." Sure enough, he grabbed the needle like an expert and started sewing and talking at the same time, to the amusement of all the women who were watching. Unlike some men who can sew and do other women's work, Alex was not the least bit hesitant to admit it. On the contrary, he was proud of these skills, and he often bragged about his spinning, knitting, and weaving. I asked Alex a few questions about quilt-related subjects. "Alex, tell me about your involvement with quilt making." "Oh, I've helped make many a quilt. I've carded a many batten to put in quilts. I used to set down and card for Mommy, and she'd have her frames up and her lining in, and I'd set there and card that batten, and she'd put 'em in. I could card rolls to spin just as good as she could, but she was a hand at that. But I could spin as good as a woman." "Did she make a lot of quilts?" "Oh, yeah, that's the biggest thing she done. Boy, she was the best hand to quilt I ever saw in my life. I never saw nobody yet that could beat her." "What did they use for the filler? Was it mostly cotton or wool?" "Well, now, just say you had some blankets or old quilts that was getting old and ragged. She'd put that in between instead of batting, but she used cotton more'n anything. They's 2 pounds of cotton in every quilt she quilted. 2 pounds of cotton will mean more than a feller thinks it will. She'd spin it and make the thread to weave the cloth, weave her lining. Then she would have to spin the thread to do the quilting with. The back of it would be hand spun? Yeah, every bit of it. And then what about the top? How would it be made? Oh, she'd quilt it out of little pieces, make it pretty, you know. Like I was telling you a while ago, I've made her many designs on the quilt top for her to quilt by. Oh, I'd make different kinds of designs on them for her. They'd be 3 squares in there that were just a foot apart. Then I'd take a big plate and set down and take a piece of that cloth that away and then go around it. Then set a compass right in the center of that and make flowers in there. Sometimes it would take her a month to quilt a quilt. She didn't pay no attention to that. She'd just work every minute she had to spare. She'd make sometimes a wreath and put a strip up there that-a-way, and that was pretty. Turn that towards the head of the bed, and it made the bed look good. I'd make some of the patterns for her. Where did you learn to make these patterns? Well, I learned the most of it from my grandpap. I just watched him, how he done it, and I done the rest of it myself. She'd quilt pieces. I'll swear you would not believe it. She'd quilt the squares that wouldn't be much bigger than that there. Alex measures off a 1/4 inch length with his thumb and finger. Yeah, I forget how many. She knowed how many it took. It took 1,000 and something or another, and she'd have them different colors, and she'd take and put different colors in there and make it pretty. People back then saved every rag they got. They'd use it for something or another, dish rag, quilt patches, or something. Lord, I've seen clothes that you couldn't tell what it was made out of for the patches. I've wore lots of them sort of that like that, but not quite that bad. Did they use wool for the inside of the quilt? They would when they's making comforts, what they called comforts. That's just as heavy again as ordinary quilt, but they'd put wool in that. Sometimes they'd use old cloths and rags, tear 'em up, and make filling out of them. Did you use the suspended or ceiling frames? That's the first quilting ever I saw done. My grandma, that was my mother's mother, she got Uncle Newt to make her some quilting hosses, and Mommy would go down there and help her quilt. I was with her down there, and she talked to her, and she said, I'd sure like to have that, the quilting hosses. That's so handy, she said. You can roll or set that over against the wall or anywhere you want to out of your way. I said, well, I'll make you a pair. She said, why, you can't. I said, I know I can. I went out and got the timber and made her a pair, like to have tickled her to death. What kind of bed covers did the real poor people have on Newman's Ridge when you were growing up? Why, they's 2/3 of the people didn't know nothing about quilting, didn't have quilts, just old shucks, leaves, rags, and things. Never had a quilt in the house. Well, old quilts are bringing good prices these days. Yeah, they's 2 women come up here, ain't been too long ago, that I'd never seed before nor heerd tell of. They's the slouchiest looking women in a way that ever I seen. They was clean, but they was slouchy dressed and everything. Great long dresses they's wearing. And they come up here and spoke to me and asked me if I had any old-timey quilts I'd sell. And I said, no, don't guess I have. Well now, she said, you've got some, I guess, and just won't sell 'em, she said. Well, do you mind me seeing some of 'em? I said, no, I don't care for you looking at some. She went in there, in his bedroom, and she was just into everything. I had a trunk sitting there, and she said, how many you got in that trunk? Well, I said, I guess it's full. She wanted me to get them out and show them to her, and I wouldn't do it. Oh, she just begged me to. She said, I'll just give you what you ask for 'em, for the one I had laying in there on the bed. Asked me who quilted it. I said, no, Mommy quilted that for me, and I said, and money won't buy it. Well, she said she thought maybe she could get 1 or 2 off of me, but I said, no, they's all made by my mother and my wife, and I ain't got none for sale. Stop right there. You gotta love Alex Stewart. And if you missed my readings about Alex Stewart, I can link to those. There's an entire book that John Rice did on him that's just wonderful, and what an amazing man. I mean, he just had so many talents and had done so many different things, and every time that every time that John Rice thought that he would trip up Alex or catch him on something that maybe he wasn't sure about, he would find out that Alex was always right. It's a really, really wonderful book. And just another amazing thing is that he could quilt. And there, he just started sewing and quilting. I can't quilt at all. I can barely sew on a button, so I can't even imagine being able to quilt and then talk while I'm talking to somebody and just know exactly what I'm doing. So that was really, really interesting and nice to hear from Alex Stewart again. Another theme through all this was how many of the ladies give away their quilts to their family, to their friends. And then even the ones that sold them, then they got the money and they give the money to the church. So in a way, they were still giving them away. They were doing it for the good of the church, not keeping the money themselves. So really, really interesting again to see their generous spirit. Lillian Steiner, the one it started with, her and her boyfriend Harvey sounded so spry. I really would have liked to have known both of them. And how neat that they had started all those years ago as teachers. Well, he was the principal and she was the teacher at that school. And then I'm sure he married too. It didn't say, but probably. And then she had married and her husband died and all that. All these years later, at the end of their life, then they were friendly with each other, going out to eat. I really, really love that. And I love that Lillian said that in the summer, I think she may be like one of the first ones that's really talked about quilting in the summer. Maybe some of them said they would at night after they got their chores done. I know Alex Stewart, not Alex, the other gentleman, I can't think of his name though, in one of the last parts we read, he said at night him and his father would quilt after, because the mother died after they had worked in the fields, and they would quilt at night. But anyway, her talking about quilting under the trees, it just makes such a beautiful scene in your mind, thinking about, under some beautiful trees in the summer with the sunshine and the breeze and the birds and people sitting there quilting. And I loved it. She said that her kids didn't like it as much as she did, but they were good hands to help her. But you just know that they thought those memories were priceless as they got older. Reminded me of so many things that I drug my feet helping Granny and Pap with when I was a child, and now I look back fondly on it. And Corey and Katie, when we would make them help us in Pap's big garden, and they really didn't like it and didn't understand it, but now they say those were some of their fondest memories, so I know her kids felt the same way. It's interesting that part too, that Harvey was the teacher and the principal. Things like that are not done today unless it's a really small school somewhere, maybe private school or something, but generally not. But even when I was a child at Martins Creek, the principal was also a teacher. So for a long time, Mr. Smart was, during my time at Martins Creek, my 8 years, Mr. Smart was the principal and also a teacher. And then he retired from being a principal, and then he was my 5th grade teacher. By then, I got to have him for 5th grade. But then Mr. Moffett was the principal, but he was also the 7th and 8th grade teacher. So I had Mr. Moffett for teacher, but he was also the principal, had to take care of all that kind of stuff. Such a different time. Then the next one that John Rice shared in this one was Hannah Lane. And she was the one that was the coal miner, was actually having to help mine the coal, and said that after her brothers left, that she stayed there and helped her father and helped him with all the different things. But what hard work. Oh my goodness, I can't even imagine shoveling that coal to one place and then shoveling it to the next, and her talking about how she could throw it with her shovel. So amazing. And all those years later, when she's not having to work like that, in her words, and I'm sure in her voice, if you could have heard it, you can hear, like when they moved to the Ferguson place, how exciting and thrilling, even all these years later, she still looks at it like that, that was a place with a mine that had a buggy where you could put the coal in the buggy and push it to the mouth of the mine, and how wonderful that was. I really loved that part. That's one of the things, I guess, especially somebody like me that loves to talk about the old days and Appalachia and everything. It's hard to explain, but it's like some of this stuff is so precious, but then there's things like that I'm so glad I don't have to do that, that times were hard. Times were so hard on them, and not just in Appalachia, and lots of other, all around the world. That's the same case, and still today in lots of places in the world. But in it's like people have kind of teased me like that. Well, you're looking back on those days with your rose-colored glasses, and it wasn't all wonderful happiness. It was hard. It was hard work, and cold weather was hard on people, and having to scrimp and save, and I guess shovel coal like she was. So I understand that for sure. But I love that part of her being amazed all those years later over the Ferguson area where when they lived on, I think it was Ferguson Creek, and they had those had the buggy for the coal, made it so much easier. Martha Turner, then she was another one he talked to, and again she had to work hard, work in the field. She said after her husband died to finish raising her kids, and that she done all the things that a man done, but she also quilted. Really, again, just amazing about the hard work. And then Willie Stooksbury Irwin, she's really interesting that she didn't really learn to quilt as a child like so many of these did when they were so young, piecing and quilting with their mothers. But after her husband and her father died, she kind of took care of them, it sounded like, until they both passed away. And then she found those scraps from her mother, and some of them was from her grandmother, and then decided that she would try to quilt, and then found out she loved it, that she really liked it. So I really thought that was an interesting, a different kind of than the ones we've been reading about that learned as a child. So she was much older, later in life, before she actually got the quilting bug, I guess you would call it. I love thinking about those scraps, how they were valuable to them and how they saved them. Granny's got fabric and quilt and scraps like that she saves. She's not quilted in a long time, but she don't want to get rid of them because they're valuable to her, because you might need them again. And I think of all the extra crochet thread Granny's got. Those things, if it's something you truly love to do, and of course it could be some other craft, if it's wood, if it's whatever it is your thing is, then you collect those things, and they're really valuable to you, even though somebody else may not be able to see the value in them. But it's really neat that Willie learned. She did see the value once she started going through them, and then thought, maybe I can do this, maybe I can learn how to quilt, and then she did and really loved it. So that's really a precious look into her quilting history. I hope you enjoyed this part of the book. I hope you'll leave a comment and let me know what jumped out at you. And as always, I hope you drop back by next Friday so we can see who he talks to next.